Before tonight's journey begins, let me know where you're listening from. Now, settle in, let your shoulders soften, let your breathing slow, and allow the day to drift quietly away. Tonight we travel to the Western Highlands of Scotland, in September of 1906, to the pier at Craigendoran on the Gairloch, where the water lies still and grey as hammered pewter beneath a sky the colour of old linen. Among them is Arthur Finch, a 48-year-old architect of bridges and railway stations, carrying one leather satchel, one silver pocket watch that has not kept true time in 7 years, and a grief that has lodged itself in the precise hour between 3 and 4 in the morning, when the house in Glasgow falls silent, and the ghost of his wife Evelyn walks through the rooms of his memory in a dress the colour of forget-me-nots. He expects only a modest, ordinary comfort, a seat on the afternoon steamer, a cup of tea in the saloon, the simple mechanical rhythm of paddles turning through salt water. But the vessel that will carry him north is not the familiar steamer he had anticipated, and in the engine room, working with oil and brass and the patience of a man who has outlived 2 oceans, there is a retired ship's engineer named Hamish MacLeod, who will speak to him of things that lie beneath the surface and of the architecture of letting go. This is the story of Arthur Finch and of one autumn night when a man who had spent his life designing fixed and certain things discovers that the strongest structures are those that learn to yield. So close your eyes, breathe gently, and let the paddle steamer carry you through the salt and the heather and sleep. The air at Craigendoran Pier held the particular chill of a September afternoon that had forgotten how to be summer. Arthur stood with his back to the ticket office, a modest wooden structure painted in the deep green and white of the Caledonian Steam Packet Company, and watched the water lap against the stone steps where the gangplank would soon be lowered. The Gairloch stretched northward in a sheet of hammered steel, its surface barely troubled by the light breeze that stirred the leaves of the rowan trees along the shore. He could smell the iodine of wet seaweed, the faint sweetness of coal smoke from a cottage chimney somewhere inland, and beneath it all, the clean mineral scent of salt water meeting fresh in the estuary. The steamer was late. This did not trouble him. He had arrived early, as he always arrived early, because the minutes spent waiting were minutes in which nothing could go wrong, nothing could be forgotten, nothing could demand his attention in ways he was not prepared to give. He set down his satchel, brown leather, scuffed at the corners, the brass clasp worn to a soft gold, and withdrew his watch from the waistcoat pocket where it had rested for so many years that the fabric had thinned to a shadow of itself. The watch face was clouded with age, the hands pointing to 2:15, though he knew it was nearer to 3:30. He had not wound it since Evelyn's funeral, and he had not had it repaired, because to have it repaired would be to admit that it could be fixed, and he was not yet ready to believe that anything could be truly fixed. The pier was quiet. A young woman in a grey traveling dress stood near the water's edge, a wicker basket at her feet, her eyes fixed on the distant point where the loch opened into the Firth of Clyde. An elderly man in a tweed cap sat on a wooden bench, smoking a pipe and reading a newspaper folded to the shipping pages. Arthur watched the smoke rise and disperse, thin blue threads dissolving into the pale sky, and he thought of the drawings he had left on his desk in Glasgow, elevations of a new railway bridge for the Highland Line, the spans calculated to the 1/8 of an inch, the stresses plotted along careful curves of graphite and ink. There was comfort in the precision of it, in the way that a bridge, once built, would stand or fall according to laws that could be measured and understood. There was no grief in mathematics. There was no widow's ghost haunting the equations of load and tension. The first sound of the steamer reached him as a distant vibration, felt through the soles of his boots before it became audible. A low thrumming, like the voice of a great creature speaking from somewhere beyond the headland, and then the churning note of paddles beginning to turn, slow and deliberate, the rhythm of a heart that had been beating for 40 years and would beat for 40 more. He turned his head toward the sound and saw her emerge from the haze at the mouth of the loch. Not the familiar turbine steamer he had expected, but an older vessel, a paddle steamer of the classic design, her twin funnels slanting slightly backward, her hull a deep black with a white band at the level of the promenade deck. The sun, breaking through a gap in the clouds for a moment, caught the brass of her nameplate and threw a flash of light across the water. Caledonia, he read. The name was faded, the letters worn by salt and wind, but it was legible still. She was not the newest vessel in the fleet, not the fastest, not the most elegant, but she was coming for him, and as she drew closer, he could see the white foam curling from beneath her paddle boxes, the steady rise and fall of her bow, the figure of the captain on the bridge, one hand resting on the brass rail, his face as impassive as the stone of the hills behind him. Arthur picked up his satchel, felt the weight of it in his hand, and took a step toward the edge of the pier. The water was gray and deep and older than anything he had ever built. The house on Blitheswood Square was silent at 3:30 in the morning, as it had been silent at 3:30 every morning for 7 years, and Arthur Finch lay awake in the narrow bed that had once been wide enough for two, watching the pale rectangle of the window gradually define itself against the darkness. The curtains were never fully drawn. Evelyn had liked to see the stars, and though she was gone, the habit remained, and so he lay in the gray half-light and watched the sky over Glasgow shift from black to indigo to the first thin wash of rose that preceded the dawn. He had not slept through a night since the spring of 1899. Not once. The doctors had given him powders and tinctures, had recommended warm milk and long walks, and the avoidance of strong tea after 6 o'clock had suggested that he might find relief in the careful application of lavender oil to his temples, or in the reading of improving literature before bed. He had tried all of these remedies, and none of them had made any difference, because the thing that kept him awake was not a disorder of the nerves, but a disorder of the heart, and the heart, as he had learned in the long months after Evelyn's death, could not be cured by powders or potions or the well-meaning advice of physicians who had never lost anyone. The bedroom was a museum of small griefs. The hairbrush on the dressing table, with its silver back and the bristles still holding a few strands of auburn hair. The book on the nightstand, a volume of Tennyson, open to the page she had been reading, the spine cracked at the place where she had laid it down for the last time. The dress in the wardrobe, the forget-me-not dress, which he had not been able to give away and had not been able to look at for more than a few seconds at a time, but which he could not bring himself to remove from the house, because to remove it would be to admit that she was never coming back to wear it. He knew, with the same cold precision he applied to his calculations of load and stress, that this was not rational. But grief, he had discovered, was not rational. It was a structure built on foundations that could not be surveyed, and it stood or fell according to laws that no engineer had ever charted. The morning routine was a ritual of small, deliberate movements, each one calculated to fill the minutes until the world became bearable. He rose at 4, when the first milk carts began to rattle along the cobbled streets below his window. He washed in cold water, because hot water required the lighting of the boiler, and the lighting of the boiler required the attention of the housemaid, and the housemaid did not arrive until 7. He dressed in the dark, his fingers finding the familiar shapes of collar and waistcoat and jacket with the ease of long practice, and he descended the narrow stairs to the kitchen, where he lit the gas ring and put the kettle on to boil. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house, and the most honest. The flagged floor was worn smooth by generations of footsteps, the range blackened by decades of coal fires, the walls yellowed by the steam of 1,000 pots of tea. Arthur made his tea in a brown pot that had belonged to his mother, and he drank it standing at the window that looked out over the small walled garden where Evelyn had planted roses. The roses were still there, overgrown now, their branches tangled and wild, but every June they produced a profusion of pale pink blooms that filled the garden with a scent so sweet it was almost painful. He did not cut them, he did not prune them, he let them grow as they would, because to impose order on them would be to impose order on something that had once been hers, and that seemed, somehow, a betrayal. The morning passed in a sequence of small obligations. The post arrived at 7:30, and he sorted through the letters with the same methodical attention he gave to everything, separating the bills from the personal correspondence, the invitations from the circulars, the pleas from the promises. There was a letter from the Caledonian Railway Company, confirming his passage on the afternoon steamer to Oban, and a letter from a colleague in Edinburgh, inquiring about the progress of the Highland Bridge drawings. He answered both with the same careful hand, the same measured prose, the same refusal to say anything that might be interpreted as a cry for help. At 9, he walked to his office on St. Vincent Street, a narrow building of gray sandstone that leaned slightly to the left, as if it had been caught in a perpetual wind. The office was on the 3rd floor, and the windows looked out over the rooftops of the city, a forest of chimney pots and slate roofs, and the occasional spire of a church that had not been attended in living memory. He sat at his desk, a vast mahogany thing covered in rolls of tracing paper and bottles of ink, and the scattered fragments of half-completed calculations, and he worked until the light began to fade, and the gas lamps on the street below flickered into life. The work was everything. It was the only thing that held him together, the only thing that gave shape to the shapeless hours. When he was drawing, when he was calculating, when he was bent over a sheet of paper with a pencil in his hand, and 1,000 pounds of steel and stone taking form beneath his fingers, he did not think about the empty chair at the dinner table, or the silence in the bedroom, or the dress that hung in the wardrobe like a ghost. He thought about spans and stresses, and the precise angle at which a beam would bear its load. He thought about the mathematics of permanence, the geometry of things that would outlast him. But the work could not fill every hour. There was always the evening, the long descent into the hour when sleep would not come, and the night, the endless night, when the house settled around him like a ship sinking into a dark sea, and he lay in the narrow bed and listened to the sound of his own breathing and felt the weight of all the years stretching ahead of him, empty and cold and full of nothing but the memory of a woman in a forget-me-not dress. The office of Finch and Mackenzie, consulting engineers, occupied the 3rd floor of a building that had been constructed in 1852, when Glasgow was still rising on the profits of cotton and iron, and the Clyde was thick with the masts of ships bound for every corner of the empire. The building had settled unevenly over the decades, so that the floor sloped perceptibly from the front windows to the back wall, and the door to the inner office had to be propped open with a wedge of oak to keep it from swinging shut of its own accord. Arthur had measured the slope once, out of professional curiosity, and had calculated that the floor had dropped by a little over 3 inches in 53 years. He had not mentioned this to the landlord, because the building was sound enough, and because the slight tilt gave the room a quality of gentle disorientation that he had come to find strangely comforting. The morning of his departure for Oban found him at his desk, a cup of tea growing cold at his elbow, a sheet of tracing paper spread before him like a map of some invisible country. The drawing was for a bridge over the River Speen, a single-span structure of wrought iron that would carry the West Highland Railway across a gorge so deep and narrow that the engineers of the previous generation had declared the route impossible. Arthur had been working on the design for 6 months, and he was satisfied with it, more than satisfied, in fact, because the numbers had aligned with a precision that felt almost musical. The stresses distributed so evenly across the span that the bridge would carry its own weight and the weight of a fully laden train with a margin of safety that bordered on the extravagant. He had always loved bridges. As a boy, growing up in the flatlands of Fife, he had spent his Sundays walking along the banks of the River Tay, watching the trains cross the great bridge at Dundee, the ironwork dark against the sky, the rhythm of the wheels on the rails like a heartbeat. He had drawn the bridge from memory, his pencil moving across the paper with a fluency that surprised even him, and he had known, from that moment, that he would spend his life building things that connected one place to another. The irony was not lost on him now, that he who had spent his career bringing distances together could not bridge the gap between who he had been and who he had become. The drawing for the Speen Bridge was a work of extraordinary delicacy. The main span was a lattice of wrought iron girders, each one connected to the next by a system of rivets and plates that Arthur had calculated to the hundredth of an inch. The piers were of granite, quarried from the hills above Fort William, and their foundations were sunk into the bedrock of the gorge at a depth of 40 feet. He had visited the site twice, standing at the edge of the chasm and feeling the wind rise from the river below, and he had known, with a certainty that was as close to faith as he had ever come, that the bridge would stand for 100 years, perhaps 200, perhaps longer than any of the men who had designed it or built it or crossed it would be remembered. His partner, Alistair Mackenzie, was a man of a different temperament. Where Arthur was meticulous, Alistair was expansive. Where Arthur measured, Alistair imagined. They had worked together for 22 years, and their partnership had survived the collapse of a bridge in the Highlands, the bankruptcy of a railway company in the Midlands, and the death of Arthur's wife, which had nearly destroyed the business, as surely as it had nearly destroyed the man. Alistair had been patient, in his way. He had not pressed Arthur to talk about his grief, had not offered empty consolations, had not suggested that time would heal wounds that were clearly fatal. He had simply continued to show up at the office, day after day, and had kept the business running while Arthur retreated into the mathematics of permanence. "He's a good man," Arthur said aloud, to no one in particular, and the words hung in the still air of the office like a question that had no answer. At 11 o'clock, he put down his pencil and stood up, stretching his arms above his head and feeling the stiffness in his shoulders from hours of bending over the drawing board. The room was warm, the fire in the grate having burned down to a bed of glowing coals, and the light through the windows had taken on the soft, golden quality that came before the autumn sun began its long decline toward the horizon. He looked at the drawing one last time, traced the line of the main span with his finger, and felt a small, quiet satisfaction in knowing that something beautiful would exist in the world, because he had put it there. But the satisfaction was brief, as it always was, and the familiar emptiness settled back into his chest as he gathered his coat and his hat and his satchel and prepared to leave for the pier. The journey to Oban was a necessity, a consultation with the railway company about the foundation work for the new bridge. But it was also an escape, and he knew it. He was running away from the empty house and the silent bedroom and the dress in the wardrobe, running toward the salt air and the rhythm of the paddles and the promise of a night in a hotel room where no one knew his name and no one expected him to be anything other than a tired traveler passing through. The gangplank was a narrow wooden bridge suspended between the stone of the pier and the iron of the steamer's deck, and Arthur crossed it with the careful, measured step of a man who had never been entirely comfortable on water. The wood flexed beneath his weight, and he could feel the faint vibration of the ship's engines through the soles of his boots, a deep, steady pulse that seemed to rise from somewhere far below the surface of the loch. He did not look down. He did not look at the water. He kept his eyes fixed on the railing of the promenade deck, and he did not stop walking until his feet were on the solid, if gently moving, surface of the steamer. The deck was nearly empty. The afternoon sailing was not the most popular, and the passengers who had boarded at Craigendoran were mostly elderly couples and solitary travelers, the kind of people who chose their journeys for reasons of their own and did not feel the need to explain them. A steward in a white jacket stood at the entrance to the saloon, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a mask of professional neutrality. He nodded as Arthur approached and gestured toward the door. "Good afternoon, sir. The saloon is to your right. Tea will be served at 4 o'clock and dinner at 7:30. Your cabin has been prepared, number 17, on the port side, main deck. If you require anything, please ring the bell." Arthur thanked him and made his way along the narrow corridor that led to the cabins. The walls were paneled in varnished mahogany, the brass fittings polished to a high shine, the carpet underfoot a deep maroon that had been trodden by thousands of feet over decades of service. The air smelled of furniture polish and coal smoke, and the faint, unmistakable tang of salt water, and it was a smell that Arthur found, to his surprise, deeply comforting. It was the smell of leaving, of moving away from one place and toward another, of the space between where the rules of ordinary life no longer applied. Cabin 17 was small and neat, a narrow berth folded against the wall, a washstand with a porcelain basin and a jug of water, a porthole that looked out over the gray expanse of the loch. Arthur set down his satchel and sat on the edge of the berth, testing the firmness of the mattress with the palm of his hand. The springs creaked in protest, and he smiled, a small, tired smile, at the thought of all the travelers who had lain in this same berth, all the dreams and anxieties and quiet hopes that had passed through this small, wooden room. He did not unpack. There was no need to unpack. He would be in Oban by the following morning, and the journey was the purpose, not the destination. He washed his hands in the basin, the water cool and clean, and he looked at his reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. The face that looked back at him was older than he remembered, the lines deeper, the eyes more shadowed, the hair at the temples touched with gray. He had not been paying attention, he realized. He had been so focused on the work, on the act of holding himself together, that he had not noticed the slow accumulation of years. He left the cabin and made his way to the promenade deck, where a few passengers had gathered at the railing to watch the last preparations for departure. The gangplank had been raised, the ropes cast off, and the steamer was beginning to move, a slow, gradual drift away from the pier that was almost imperceptible until he looked back and saw the gap of water widening between the hull and the stone. The engine room bells rang, a series of sharp, metallic notes that carried through the deck, and the paddles began to turn, slow and deep, churning the water into a froth of white and green that spread out behind the steamer like a wake of foam and light. The pier receded, the buildings of Craigendoran shrinking to a cluster of gray shapes against the green of the hills, and the loch opened before them, broad and silver, the shores falling away on either side until they were in the middle of the water, surrounded by sky and sea and the steady, rhythmic pulse of the engine. Arthur stood at the railing, his hands resting on the varnished wood, and he felt something shift in his chest, a small, barely perceptible loosening, as if the knots that had held him together for 7 years had begun, at last, to give way. The wind was cool and salt-tinged, and it filled his lungs with a freshness that was almost painful in its clarity. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, he did not think of the empty house, or the silent bedroom, or the dress in the wardrobe. He thought only of the water, and the rhythm of the paddles, and the slow, steady journey north into the fading light. The Caledonia steamed southward through the narrows of the Gara Loch, her paddles turning with a steady, unhurried rhythm that seemed to have been established long before any of her current passengers had come aboard, and that would continue long after they had disembarked and gone their separate ways. Arthur stood at the port railing, his coat collar turned up against the wind, and watched the wooded slopes of the Rosneath Peninsula slide past, the trees a deep autumnal green, the occasional white gleam of a house or a farmstead visible through the branches. The air was cool and clean, and the salt taste of it was a welcome change from the coal smoke and horse dung and the thousand other odors of the Glasgow streets. The steamer rounded the point at Greenock, and the Firth of Clyde opened before them, a vast expanse of grey water that stretched to the horizon, where the islands of Bute and Arran lay like sleeping whales, their shapes indistinct in the haze of late afternoon. The wind freshened, and the deck began to lift and fall in a gentle swell that was more felt than seen, a slow, rolling motion that Arthur found himself adapting to with surprising ease. He had never been a confident sailor, but there was something about the rhythm of the steamer, the steady pulse of the engines, and the soft creak of the woodwork that seemed to invite surrender rather than resistance. A young man in a dark suit approached him, a notebook in one hand and a pencil in the other, and introduced himself as Mr. Jameson, a journalist from the Glasgow Herald, traveling to Oban to write a series of articles on the fishing communities of the West Coast. He was in his late 20s, with a thin, eager face and a nervous habit of tapping his pencil against his notebook as he spoke. He asked Arthur about his work, and Arthur, after a moment's hesitation, told him about the Speen Bridge, about the gorge and the granite and the mathematics of the span. The journalist listened with genuine interest, taking notes in a rapid, illegible hand, and Arthur found himself warming to the young man, despite his natural reserve. "The West Highland Line," Mr. Jameson said, his pencil moving across the page. "They say it's the most difficult railway in Britain. The terrain, I mean. The bogs and the mountains and the lochs. It's difficult," Arthur agreed, "but it's not impossible. The Romans built roads across the Alps. The Victorians built railways through the Himalayas. The challenge is not the terrain, but the will to overcome it." "And the bridge across the Speen? That's your doing?" "It's my design, yes. But bridges are not built by architects alone. They are built by riveters and ironworkers and men who spend their days standing on scaffolding 100 feet above a river, driving hot rivets into cold steel. I draw the lines, but they do the work." The journalist nodded and made another note, and Arthur looked out across the water, where the smoke of a distant steamer was just visible on the horizon, a thin, dark line against the pale sky. He thought of the men who would build the Speen Bridge, of the hours they would spend in the cold and the wind and the rain, of the faith they would place in his calculations, and he felt a weight of responsibility that was both heavy and oddly comforting. The bridge was his, but it was not only his. It belonged to the men who would build it, and to the trains that would cross it, and to the generations who would take it for granted, as they took for granted all the structures that had been built by the hands of those who had come before them. The Caledonia slowed as she approached the pier at Dunoon, a small town of whitewashed houses and green hills that rose steeply from the water's edge. A handful of passengers disembarked, their figures growing smaller as they made their way along the pier and into the streets of the town, and a few more came aboard, their voices carrying across the water as they called out to friends and relatives on the shore. The stop was brief, no more than 10 minutes, and then the paddles began to turn again, and the steamer resumed her journey, heading southwest toward the mouth of the Kyles of Bute. The light was beginning to fade, the sky taking on the soft, golden tones of late afternoon, and the islands ahead were becoming more distinct, their shapes resolving into ridges and valleys, the dark patches of woodland and the lighter patches of heath and pasture. Arthur watched the coastline with a quiet attention, noting the changes in the vegetation, the gradual shift from the cultivated fields of the lowlands to the wilder, more rugged landscape of the highlands. The hills grew steeper, the trees sparser, the houses fewer and farther between. The world was becoming simpler, and it was a simplicity that Arthur found himself grateful for. He walked to the stern of the steamer, where the wake spread out behind them in a long, white V, and he watched the water churn and foam and settle, the marks of their passage gradually erased by the indifferent sea. The wind was stronger here, and he had to hold on to the railing to keep his balance, but he did not mind. There was a freedom in the exposure, a feeling of being part of the wind and the water and the sky, of being nothing more than a passenger on a journey that had begun long before he was born and would continue long after he was gone. The Caledonia turned into the narrow channel of the Cales of Butte, and the world changed. The open expanse of the firth narrowed to a passage barely a quarter of a mile wide, the hills rising steeply on either side, their slopes covered in a dense growth of oak and birch and hazel, the branches of the trees reaching out over the water as if they were trying to touch the steamer as she passed. The water was darker here, deeper, the surface broken by the occasional swirl of a current or the leap of a fish, and the air was filled with the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves and the rich, fertile smell of the forest. Arthur had never been through the Kyles before, and he was unprepared for the beauty of the place. The hills were not the dramatic, jagged peaks of the true highlands, but they had a quiet, gentle grandeur that was no less affecting for its modesty. The colors were deep and autumnal, the greens of the trees shading into browns and golds, the gray of the rock softened by the low, slanting light of the afternoon sun. The water was so still that the steamer seemed to be gliding through a mirror, the reflection of the hills and the trees and the sky merging with the real in a way that was both beautiful and disorienting. He was not alone at the railing. A woman stood a few feet away, her hands resting on the rail, her gaze fixed on the hills ahead. She was perhaps 60, dressed in a plain black coat and a hat trimmed with a single feather, and there was something in her posture, the stillness of her, the quiet attention she gave to the passing landscape, that suggested she was a traveler of long experience, someone who had learned to be content with her own company. Arthur did not speak to her, and she did not speak to him, but there was a comfort in the shared silence, in the knowledge that they were both watching the same hills, the same water, the same light, and that neither of them felt the need to fill the space with words. The Kyles opened into the wider waters of Loch Ridden, and the steamer slowed as she approached the pier at Tygnabruich, a small village of white cottages clustered around a natural harbor. The pier was busy with fishing boats, their nets spread out to dry, their hulls painted in shades of blue and green and red that had been faded by years of sun and salt. A group of children stood on the shore, waving at the steamer, and Arthur waved back, a small, tentative gesture, and felt a flicker of something that might have been happiness. The stop at Tygnabruich was longer than the stop at Dunoon, and Arthur decided to stretch his legs on the pier. He walked the length of the wooden structure, his footsteps echoing in the quiet, and he looked at the fishing boats, at the nets and the ropes and the buoys, at the small, practical details of a life that was as different from his own as it was possible to imagine. The fishermen who worked these waters did not think about bridges or stresses or the mathematics of permanence. They thought about the tides and the weather and the habits of the herring, about the simple, immediate needs of survival. And Arthur, standing on the pier in the fading light of the autumn afternoon, felt a sudden, sharp longing for that simplicity, for a life in which the only question was whether the fish would come, and the only answer was the weight of the catch in the bottom of the boat. He walked back to the steamer as the last of the daylight was fading, the sky above the hills turning a deep, dusky purple, the first stars appearing in the east. The saloon was warm and bright, the gas lamps casting a soft, yellow glow over the tables and the chairs, and the smell of tea and toast and coal smoke filled the air. He sat down at a table near the window, and a steward brought him a cup of tea and a plate of buttered scones, and he ate and drank in the quiet, companionable silence of the saloon, surrounded by strangers who were no longer strangers, fellow travelers on a journey that was carrying them all, in their different ways, toward the same destination. The steamer left Tygnabruich as the night was closing in, the lights of the village receding behind them, the darkness of the hills and the water merging into a single, unbroken black. The paddles turned, the engine hummed, and the Caledonia steamed on through the night, carrying Arthur Finch toward the unknown and toward the quiet, unexpected encounter that would change everything. The night had settled over the water like a blanket of dark velvet, and the saloon had thinned to a handful of passengers, most of them reading or dozing in the comfortable chairs, the quiet murmur of conversation punctuated by the occasional clink of a teacup or the rustle of a newspaper. Arthur had finished his tea and his scones, and he had sat for a while watching the darkness through the window, the occasional glimmer of a light on the shore, the faint reflection of the saloon's lamps on the glass. The warmth and the gentle motion of the steamer had made him drowsy, but he did not want to sleep. He wanted to stay awake, to feel the journey in its entirety, to be present for every moment of it. He rose from his chair and walked through the saloon, past the bar and the steward's pantry, past the door that led to the first-class cabins, and down a narrow stairway that he had not noticed before. The stairway was steep and dimly lit, the treads worn smooth by generations of feet, the walls lined with pipes and cables that carried the lifeblood of the steamer through her iron veins. The air grew warmer as he descended, and the smell of oil and coal and hot metal grew stronger, a smell that was not unpleasant, but that spoke of work and effort and the hidden machinery of the world. At the bottom of the stairway, he found a door, a heavy door of iron and wood, with a small brass plaque that read, "Engine room, no admittance except on business." The door was slightly ajar, and a warm, golden light spilled through the gap, along with the sound of a voice, a man's voice, low and steady, speaking in a language that Arthur did not recognize at first, but that he gradually identified as Gaelic, the old language of the Highlands, the language of the hills and the lochs, and the people who had lived there before the English came. He hesitated. The door was marked with a clear prohibition, and Arthur was a man who respected prohibitions, who had spent his life following rules and regulations, and the precise specifications of blueprints and contracts. But the voice was so calm, so unhurried, so completely at home in the warm, oily darkness of the engine room, that he found himself pushing the door open, just a little, and peering through the gap. The engine room was a cathedral of iron and brass. The great steam engine stood in the center of the space, its cylinders gleaming with oil, its pistons moving in a slow, rhythmic dance that was almost hypnotic in its regularity. The light from a row of gas lamps glinted off the polished surfaces, and the heat radiated from the engine in waves that Arthur could feel on his face, even from the doorway. The air was thick with the smell of hot oil and steam, and the faint, metallic scent of iron that had been worked and reworked until it was as smooth as silk. The man who was speaking stood beside the engine, a cloth in his hand, wiping a brass fitting with a slow, methodical motion that was almost meditative. He was old, perhaps 70, with a face that was weathered and lined, like the face of a man who had spent his life in the open air, but his hands were steady, and his eyes were clear and bright, and he looked up as Arthur entered the room, and he smiled. Come in," he said, in a voice that was soft and warm, with the faint, musical lilt of the Highlands. "I was wondering when you would find your way down here. I've been watching you, up on the deck, looking at the water and the hills, as if you were saying goodbye to them, and I thought to myself, that man will find his way to the engine room, sooner or later. There's something about the way he stands, the way he holds himself, that speaks of a man who understands the importance of what lies beneath the surface. Arthur stepped through the door, and the old man gestured to a stool beside the engine, and Arthur sat down, feeling the warmth of the iron through his clothes, the steady pulse of the engine through the floor. The old man went back to his work, wiping the brass fitting with a slow, patient rhythm, and he did not speak for a long time, and Arthur did not feel the need to fill the silence. The engine room was a world of its own, a world of heat and light and the steady, rhythmic motion of the pistons, and Arthur found himself sinking into it, into the warmth and the sound and the smell, into the feeling of being somewhere that was not quite the ordinary world, but something older, something deeper, something that had been there before the bridges and the railways and the cities of the lowlands, and would be there still, long after they had all returned to dust. Arthur sat on the stool beside the great engine, feeling the warmth of the iron through the fabric of his trousers, the steady pulse of the machinery transmitted through the metal floor. The old man continued his work, wiping the brass fitting with a cloth that was itself a study in patience, each movement deliberate and unhurried, as if time moved differently in the engine room, as if the hours and minutes that governed the world above had no dominion here. "You are wondering," the old man said, without looking up from his work, "what it is that I was saying when you came down the stairs. You are wondering about the language and the words, and whether they were meant for the engine or for myself." Arthur nodded, though the man could not see him. "I confess, I was curious. I have heard Gaelic spoken before, in the Highlands, but never in such a setting, and never with such intimacy." The old man smiled, a slow, gentle smile that creased the corners of his eyes. "The engine understands," he said. "It does not understand the words, of course, but it understands the tone, the rhythm, the intention. It is a living thing, this engine. It breathes, it moves, it speaks in its own language, which is the language of steam and pressure and the turning of the crankshaft. And I have learned, over the years, that if I speak to it in the old tongue, it responds more willingly. It is a superstition, perhaps, but there are older things than superstition, and they have their own wisdom." He set down the cloth and turned to face Arthur fully, his eyes bright in the warm, golden light of the gas lamps. "My name is Alasdair MacLeod," he said, extending a hand that was rough and calloused, the hand of a man who had spent a lifetime working with iron and steel and the elemental forces of fire and water. "I have been the chief engineer of the Caledonia for 37 years, and before that, I was her second engineer for 12 years, and before that, I was a boy in the village of Tobermory, on the Isle of Mull, where I learned to mend nets and read the weather and listen to the voices of the machines that were beginning to change the world." Arthur shook the man's hand, feeling the strength in the grip, the warmth of the contact. "Arthur Finch," he said. "I am a civil engineer from Edinburgh. I build bridges." Alasdair nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. "Bridges," he said, the word rolling off his tongue with a different weight, a different texture than it had when Arthur had spoken it. "Yes, I thought as much. There is a certain kind of man who builds bridges, and a certain kind of man who tends engines, and they are not so different as they might appear. Both of them are concerned with the relationship between forces, with the tension and the compression, with the points at which things meet and hold. Both of them know that the greatest dangers are not in the visible structures, but in the invisible ones, the stresses that cannot be seen, the weaknesses that lie hidden beneath the surface." He reached into the pocket of his overalls and produced a small, worn pipe, which he began to fill with tobacco from a leather pouch, his fingers moving with the same slow, deliberate precision that had characterized his work on the brass fitting. "May I?" he asked, and Arthur nodded, though the question had been more of a courtesy than a request for permission. The old man lit the pipe with a match that he struck against the sole of his boot, and the smoke rose in a thin blue ribbon, mingling with the steam and the oil and the warm metallic air of the engine room. "I have been watching you," Alistair said, after a long, comfortable silence. "Not in a way that would trouble you, but in the way that an old man watches the passengers who pass through his care, trying to understand what they are carrying, what they are leaving behind, what they are hoping to find at the end of the journey. And I have noticed that you look at the sea not as a thing to be crossed, but as a thing to be understood. You look at the water as if you are trying to read something in its surface, some message that it is trying to convey." Arthur was silent for a moment, watching the smoke from the old man's pipe curl and twist in the warm air. "I am not sure what I am looking for," he said, and the admission surprised him, because he had not spoken the words aloud before, had not even fully acknowledged them to himself. "I thought I was coming to Oban to inspect a bridge, to advise on the maintenance of a structure that I helped to design, but I am beginning to think that the bridge is not the real purpose of this journey." Alistair nodded, his eyes fixed on the slow, rhythmic motion of the pistons, the great rods sliding in and out of the cylinders with a regularity that was almost hypnotic. "The real purpose of any journey," he said, "is never what we think it is when we set out. We make our plans, we buy our tickets, we pack our bags, and we tell ourselves that we are going from one place to another, for this reason or that. But the journey itself has its own intentions, its own purposes, and it will take us where it wants us to go, whether we are ready or not." He drew on his pipe, and the smoke curled around his face, softening the lines and shadows, making him look older and younger at the same time. "I have been making this crossing for nearly 50 years, he said. "I have carried passengers from Glasgow to Oban, from Oban to the islands, from the islands back to the mainland. I have carried lovers and mourners, merchants and pilgrims, people who were running away, and people who were running towards something. And I have come to understand that the water does not care about any of it. The water is indifferent. It has been here for 10,000 years, and it will be here for 10,000 more, and it will carry us all, in the end, to the same destination." He paused, and the only sound was the steady breath of the engine, the rhythmic thump of the paddles, the faint hiss of steam from a pipe somewhere in the shadows. "But that is not a sad thing," he said softly. "It is a comforting thing. The indifference of the water, the indifference of the sea, means that we are free. We are free to make our own meanings, to find our own purposes, to carry our own burdens, or to set them down, and the water will not judge us, and the water will not remember." Arthur felt something shift in his chest, a loosening, a release, like a knot that had been pulled tight for so long that he had forgotten it was there, and was now beginning to give way. He did not speak, because there were no words that could capture what he was feeling, and because the old man's words were enough, more than enough, filling the warm, oily air of the engine room with a wisdom that was older than the steam engine, older than the bridges, older than the cities and the railways and the factories that had changed the face of the world. They sat in silence for a long time, the two of them, in the cathedral of iron and brass, listening to the steady pulse of the engine, the faint creak of the hull, the distant sound of the sea, and Arthur Finch, the bridge builder from Edinburgh, felt the first stirrings of something that might, in time, become peace. The Caledonia steamed on through the darkness, her paddles turning with a steady, unhurried rhythm, her lights casting long, golden reflections on the black water. Arthur emerged from the engine room with a feeling of lightness, as if he had left something behind in the warm, oily embrace of the machinery, something that had been weighing on him for longer than he could remember. He climbed the narrow stairway to the main deck, and the cool night air hit his face like a benediction, clean and salt-tinged, and full of the promise of change. The deck was empty now, the other passengers having retreated to the warmth of the saloon or the privacy of their cabins. Arthur walked to the railing and stood there, looking out at the darkness, feeling the movement of the steamer beneath his feet, the gentle rise and fall of the deck as the ship negotiated the swell of the open water. The sky was clear, the stars bright and hard, and the moon had risen, a thin sliver of silver that cast just enough light to reveal the dark shapes of the hills on either side, the faint gleam of the water between them. They were passing through the Sound of Mull, he realized, the narrow channel that separated the Isle of Mull from the mainland, a stretch of water that was notorious for its currents and its sudden squalls, but that tonight was calm, almost glassy, as if the sea itself had decided to grant them a moment of peace. The lights of a village appeared on the starboard side, a cluster of small, yellow windows that seemed to float on the darkness, and Arthur watched them approach and then recede, a brief glimpse of lives that were being lived in parallel to his own, unknown and unknowable. He thought about Clara, as he always did when he was alone with the night and the water. He thought about the way she had looked at him on the morning of the accident, the way her hand had felt in his, the way she had laughed at something he had said, a small, ordinary joke that he could not now remember, but that had made her eyes crinkle at the corners in that way that had always made his heart ache with love. He thought about the moment when he had received the telegram, the words blurring on the page, the world tilting and shifting around him, as if the very ground had become unstable, as if the solid, certain structures that he had built his life upon had turned out to be no more substantial than mist. But the pain when it came was different. It was not the sharp, cutting pain of the early days, the pain that had made it impossible to breathe, to eat, to sleep. It was a softer pain, a duller ache, like the memory of a wound that had healed but left a scar, a permanent reminder of what had been lost. And somehow, standing on the deck of the paddle steamer, with the cold night air on his face and the sound of the water in his ears, the pain felt manageable, bearable even, in a strange way, welcome. He did not know how long he stood there. Time had become fluid, the minutes and hours losing their definition, merging into a single, continuous present that was measured not by the clock, but by the rhythm of the paddles, the movement of the stars across the sky, the gradual shift in the quality of the darkness as the night began to turn toward morning. The steamer passed through the narrows at the entrance to Loch Linhey, and the water opened out into a wider expanse, the hills on either side receding into the distance, the sky growing lighter in the east, a pale, grayish green that hinted at the dawn to come. He heard footsteps on the deck behind him and turned to see the woman in the black coat, the one who had stood beside him at the railing earlier in the day, looking out at the hills of the Kyles of Butte. She was carrying a cup of tea, and she smiled at him, a small, tired smile, as she came to stand beside him at the railing. "You are an early riser," she said, her voice soft and warm, with a hint of an accent that Arthur could not place. "Or perhaps you have not been to bed at all." Arthur smiled back, a genuine smile, the first that had come easily in a long time. "I have not been to bed," he admitted. "I have been in the engine room, talking to the chief engineer, and on the deck watching the night pass. It seems a waste to sleep through such a journey." The woman nodded, sipping her tea. "I know what you mean," she said. "I have made this crossing many times, and I always try to stay awake for as much of it as I can. There is something about the night journey, the feeling of being carried through the darkness by a force that is not your own, that is deeply restful, even when you are not sleeping." She paused, looking out at the water, the steam from her tea rising and mingling with the cold night air. "My name is Margaret Ross," she said. I am a school teacher from a village near Oban. I have been visiting my sister in Glasgow, and now I am going home. Arthur Finch, he said. I am a civil engineer. I am going to Oban to inspect a bridge. Margaret smiled. A bridge, she said, as if the word held a special significance for her. That is a fine thing to do. Bridges connect people, bring them together, make it possible for them to reach places that would otherwise be inaccessible. I have always thought that there is something noble about the work of a bridge builder. Arthur looked at her, surprised by the observation, which was not the sort of thing that most people said when they learned of his profession. That is a kind way of putting it, he said. Most people simply ask whether my bridges are safe, or how long they took to build, or how much they cost. Margaret laughed, a soft, musical sound that was carried away by the wind. I am a school teacher, she said. I am accustomed to looking for the deeper meaning in things, and I have always believed that every structure, every object, every action has a meaning that goes beyond its surface purpose. A bridge is not just a way of crossing a river. It is a statement about the human desire to connect, to overcome obstacles, to reach out to the other side. She finished her tea and set the cup down on the railing, her hands clasped in front of her, her eyes fixed on the growing light in the east. I think, she said slowly, that we are all building bridges, in our own ways. Some of us are building bridges to the past, trying to reach across the distance that separates us from the people we have lost. And some of us are building bridges to the future, trying to find a way to reach the people we might still become. Arthur did not reply. He stood beside her, watching the dawn spread across the sky, the colors shifting from gray to pink to gold, the water catching the light and turning it into a shimmering expanse of silver and rose. And he felt, for the first time in 18 months, that he was not alone. The first light of dawn was creeping over the hills of Morvern when Arthur made his way back to the engine room. The door was still ajar, the warm, golden light still spilling through the gap, and he found Alastair MacLeod sitting on a wooden crate beside the great engine, his pipe extinguished, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes closed. For a moment, Arthur thought the old man was asleep, but then Alastair opened his eyes and smiled, a slow, gentle smile that seemed to come from a great depth of peace. I thought you might return, he said. There is something about the engine room that calls to certain people, especially at dawn. It is the hour when the world is most quiet, most still, and the voice of the machine is clearest. Arthur sat down on the stool, the warmth of the engine enveloping him, the familiar smell of oil and steam and hot metal filling his senses. I met a woman on the deck, he said, a school teacher, returning to Oban. She spoke about bridges. She said that we are all building bridges in our own ways. Alastair nodded slowly, his eyes distant, as if he were looking at something that was far away in time, rather than in space. She is right, he said. We are all building bridges. But the bridges that matter most are the ones that we build to ourselves, the ones that help us to cross the distance between who we are and who we might become. And those bridges are the hardest to build, because the foundations are not made of stone or steel, but of memory and hope and the difficult work of letting go. He was silent for a long moment, and then he began to speak, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of years and the wisdom of a life that had been lived fully, without reservation. I was not always an old man in an engine room, he said, a hint of humor in his voice. There was a time when I was young and foolish and full of the certainty that I knew everything worth knowing. I was born in Tobermory, as I told you, and I grew up on the water, learning to read the tides and the weather, learning to handle a boat and mend a net. My father was a fisherman, and his father before him, and I was expected to follow the same path, to spend my life on the sea, as they had done. He paused, picking up his pipe, turning it over in his hands, but not lighting it. But I wanted more. I wanted to understand the machines that were changing the world, the engines that were powering the ships and the trains and the factories. I wanted to know how they worked, what made them tick, what forces were at play inside their iron hearts. And so, when I was 17, I left Tobermory and went to Glasgow to find work in the shipyards, to learn the trade of the engineer. He smiled, a rueful smile, as if he were remembering a mistake that he had made long ago and had long since forgiven himself for. I learned the trade, and I learned it well, but I also learned something else, something that I had not expected. I learned that the machines were not enough. They were fascinating, they were powerful, they were beautiful in their own way, but they could not fill the emptiness that I carried inside me. I had left Tobermory, but I had not left behind the boy who had grown up on the water, the boy who had listened to the stories of the old men, the stories about the hills and the lochs and the people who had lived there before the English came. He set the pipe down and looked at Arthur, his eyes clear and bright, the color of the sea on a summer afternoon. I spent 10 years in Glasgow, and I became a good engineer, but I was not happy. I was successful, I was respected, but I was not at peace. And then, one day, I heard that the Caledonia was looking for a second engineer, and I applied for the position, and I was accepted. And when I stepped onto the deck of this steamer, for the first time, I felt something that I had not felt in a decade. I felt that I was coming home. He gestured around the engine room, his hand sweeping across the brass and the iron and the gleaming machinery. "This is my home," he said. "This is where I belong. I have spent 37 years in this room, tending to this engine, listening to its voice, learning its moods and its needs, and I have come to understand that the engine is not just a machine, it is a living thing, a part of the ship, a part of the sea, a part of me. And in tending to it, I have learned to tend to myself." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if he were sharing a secret that was too precious to be spoken aloud. "There was a woman," he said. "Her name was Eilif. She was the daughter of a fisherman from the Isle of Skye, and I met her on one of my first voyages when she was traveling to Oban to visit her sister. She had hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes that were the color of the sea after a storm, and she had a laugh that made the world seem brighter, lighter, more full of possibility." He paused, and the silence in the engine room was absolute. The only sound the steady breath of the machine, the faint hiss of steam, the distant murmur of the water against the hull. "We were married for 32 years, he said, "and they were the happiest years of my life. And we had a small house in Oban, overlooking the harbor, and we would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the steamers come and go, watching the sun set behind the hills of Mull. And she would tell me about her day, and I would tell her about the engine, and we would laugh, and we would be content." He looked down at his hands, the hands that had tended the engine for so many years, the hands that had held his wife's hands, that had touched her face, that had felt the warmth of her skin. "She died 5 years ago," he said, his voice barely audible. "A pneumonia that took her in the winter, when the winds were howling and the sea was gray, and the world seemed to have lost all its color. And I thought, for a time, that I would not survive the loss. I thought that the engine would stop, that the ship would sink, that everything that had given my life meaning would crumble and fall." He raised his eyes to meet Arthur's, and there was no sorrow in them, only a deep, quiet peace. But the engine did not stop, the ship did not sink, and I learned, slowly, painfully, that the love does not end when the person is gone. It changes, it transforms, it becomes something else, something that is not quite the same, but that is still real, still present, still a source of warmth and light. I carry Eilif with me, in this engine room, in the rhythm of the pistons, in the hiss of the steam, She is part of the ship now, part of the sea, part of the journey that I am still making, and I am grateful for that. He reached out and placed his hand on the iron casing of the engine, a gesture of affection, of familiarity, of love. The pain does not go away, he said, but it changes. It becomes softer, gentler, more like a companion than a wound. And one day, you wake up and you realize that you have built a bridge across the distance, not to the person you have lost, but to the person you have become. And that bridge is strong enough to hold you, to carry you forward, to take you to the places that you still need to go. The engine room fell silent, the words of the old man hanging in the air like the smoke from his extinguished pipe, warm and fragrant and full of meaning. Arthur sat on the stool, his hands resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the slow, rhythmic motion of the pistons, the great rods sliding in and out of the cylinders with a regularity that was almost hypnotic, almost soothing. He had come to the engine room seeking something, though he had not known what it was. He had found it. He thought about Clara. He thought about the way she had looked at him on the morning of the accident, the way her hand had felt in his, the way she had laughed at something he had said. He thought about the moment when he had received the telegram, the words blurring on the page, the world tilting and shifting around him, as if the very ground had become unstable. And he thought about the 18 months that had followed, the long, gray months of grief and numbness, and the mechanical performance of a life that had lost all meaning. But the thoughts were different now. They were not sharp, not cutting, not painful in the way that they had been. They were softer, gentler, like the memory of a dream that had faded with the morning light, leaving only a trace, a residue, a warmth that lingered in the chest. He did not know exactly when the change had occurred, or how, or why. It had been gradual, like the turning of the tide, the slow shift of the water from one direction to another. But it had happened. The knot had loosened. The bridge had been built. He stood up, slowly, his legs stiff from the hours of sitting, his body tired but not weary. He thanked Alistair, who nodded and smiled, and then he walked out of the engine room, up the narrow stairway, and onto the deck. The dawn had fully broken, and the world was bathed in a soft, golden light that seemed to have been painted onto the hills and the water with a gentle, careful hand. The steamer was approaching the entrance to Oban Bay, the great curve of the shoreline sweeping around to reveal the town, the islands, the distant mountains of the Outer Hebrides. He stood at the railing, watching the approach, feeling the cool morning air on his face, the salt spray on his lips. He thought about the bridge that he had come to inspect, the structure that had been the ostensible reason for his journey. He would inspect it, he would write his report, he would advise on the maintenance that was needed, and then he would go home, to Edinburgh, to the flat that he and Clara had shared, to the life that he had been living, in a manner of speaking, for the past 18 months. But it would not be the same. He would not be the same. He had left something behind, in the engine room of the bridge. Caledonia. Something that he had been carrying for too long, and he had taken something with him, something that would stay with him, that would carry him forward, that would help him to build the next bridge, and the next, and the next, until he reached the place that he was meant to be. He did not know what that place was. He did not need to know. The water would carry him. The engine would drive him. The journey would take him where he needed to go. And for the first time in 18 months, he was ready to let it. Sleep came, as it always does, not with a sudden descent, but with a gradual, almost imperceptible loosening of the threads that held consciousness together. Arthur had made his way to his cabin, a small, tidy space with a narrow bunk, a washstand, a porthole that looked out onto the gray, morning light of Oban Bay. He had washed his face and his hands, had taken off his coat and his boots, had lain down on the bunk with the thin, clean-smelling blanket pulled up to his chin. And then he had waited. He had not expected to sleep. The night had been long, the hours filled with conversation and reflection, and the slow, patient work of the heart. But as he lay there, listening to the sounds of the steamer, the distant thrum of the engine, the creak of the hull, the muffled voices of the crew on the deck above, he felt the tension begin to drain from his body, the muscles in his shoulders and his neck and his back releasing their grip, the bones settling into the mattress as if they were made of something heavier than bone, something that was slowly, gently sinking into the earth. Sleep came. It did not ask permission. It did not announce itself with a fanfare or a flourish. It simply arrived, like the tide, like the dawn, like the turning of the season, and it wrapped itself around him, warm and soft and complete. He dreamed of water, not the sharp, cold water of the North Sea, but the dark, still water of a loch, deep and quiet and ancient, reflecting the sky and the hills and the trees that lined the shore. He dreamed of a boat, a small, wooden boat drifting on the surface of the water, and he dreamed of a woman sitting in the bow, her hair the color of autumn leaves, her eyes the color of the sea after a storm. She was singing, a soft, low song in a language that he did not understand, but that he felt in his chest, in his bones, in the very core of his being. He tried to see her face, but the light was dim, the water was dark, and the boat was drifting farther and farther away, carried by a current that he could not see, could not feel, could not control. And he felt a moment of panic, a surge of fear, the desperate need to reach her, to hold her, to keep her from disappearing into the mist that was rising from the surface of the loch. But then the singing stopped, and the woman turned, and she looked at him, and he saw her face clearly for the first time. It was Clara, and she was smiling. She did not speak. She did not need to speak. The smile said everything that needed to be said, everything that could possibly be said, in this world or any other. It said that she was all right, that she was at peace, that she was waiting for him, but that there was no hurry, no rush, no need to be anywhere but here, now, in this moment, on this water, under this sky. He watched the boat drift away, the mist closing around it, the shape of it growing fainter and fainter until it was gone, lost in the gray, soft light of the dream. And he did not feel sad. He did not feel afraid. He felt a deep, profound calm, the kind of calm that comes after a storm, when the wind has died and the rain has stopped, and the world is quiet and clean and new. And then the dream faded, and there was only the darkness, the warm, soft darkness of the cabin, the steady rhythm of the engine, the gentle rise and fall of the steamer on the water. And Arthur Finch slept, truly slept, for the first time in 18 months, his breath slow and even, his body still, his mind quiet, his heart at rest. The night passed, as nights always do, though the passage of time was not marked by clocks or bells or the anxious counting of hours, but by the slow, subtle shifts in the quality of the darkness, the gradual change in the light that filtered through the porthole, the fading of the stars as the sky began to lighten in the east. Arthur slept through it all, a deep, dreamless sleep that was like a long, slow exhale, the release of a breath that had been held for far too long. The steamer lay at anchor in Oban Bay, her engines quiet, her paddles still, her hull rocking gently on the gentle swell of the morning tide. The crew moved about their duties in silence, their voices low, their footsteps soft, as if they, too, understood that something sacred was taking place in the cabin where the bridge builder slept. The gulls wheeled and cried overhead, and the first ferries of the day began to stir in the harbor, their whistles sounding across the water, but Arthur did not hear them. He slept through the ringing of the ship's bell, through the calls of the deckhands, through the clatter of the anchor chain as it was hauled aboard. He slept through the arrival of the train from the south, the hiss of steam and the clang of couplings, the voices of the passengers as they made their way down the pier. He slept through the slow, steady advance of the morning, the sun climbing higher in the sky, the shadows growing shorter, the world coming to life around him. And in his sleep, the healing continued. The invisible wounds, the cracks and fissures that had been hidden beneath the surface, the stresses that had been accumulating for months and years, they began to mend, slowly, patiently, like the gentle knitting of bone, like the slow growth of a tree, like the quiet work of the earth as it turns winter into spring. When he finally woke, the light in the cabin was different. It was no longer the gray, tentative light of dawn, but the clear, golden light of mid-morning, the light that dances on the water and fills the world with a sense of possibility. He lay still for a moment, blinking, orienting himself, feeling the unfamiliar weight of his body, the unfamiliar lightness in his chest. He did not know what time it was, or what day it was, or what he was supposed to do next, and he did not care. For the first time in a very long time, he was simply present, simply here, simply breathing in and out, feeling the air fill his lungs, feeling the blood move through his veins, feeling the simple, miraculous fact of being alive. He sat up, slowly, and swung his legs over the side of the bunk. The cabin was small and plain, but it was filled with light, and the light was beautiful. He stood up, walked to the porthole, and looked out at Oban Bay, at the blue water and the green hills and the white houses climbing up the slopes, at the islands in the distance, at the sky stretching away to the horizon, endless and full of promise. And he smiled. The town of Oban was waking to a day of rare and perfect beauty. The sun hung low in the clear blue sky, casting long shadows and bathing the stone buildings in a warm, golden glow that seemed to have been borrowed from a more benevolent season. The streets were busy with the morning trade, shopkeepers sweeping their doorsteps, fishermen unloading their catch, women in aprons hurrying to the bakers with baskets on their arms. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, and the faint, sweet scent of baking bread, and the cries of the gulls mixed with the distant sound of a steam whistle and the clatter of hooves on cobblestones. Arthur Finch stepped off the gangplank and onto the pier, his carpet bag in his hand, his coat buttoned against the cool morning air. He paused for a moment, looking back at the Caledonia, at the white hull and the red paddles and the black smoke rising from the funnel, at the crew who were busy with the work of the ship, at the passengers who were making their way to the train station or the hotels or the waiting arms of family and friends. He did not see Alistair MacLeod among the crew, but he did not need to see him. The old man was there, in the rhythm of the engine, in the hiss of the steam, in the warmth of the iron that had carried him through the night. He would always be there, in the memory of the journey, in the words that had been spoken, in the bridge that had been built. He turned and walked down the pier, his footsteps steady on the worn wooden planks. The town lay before him, full of light and sound and the ordinary business of living, and he stepped into it without hesitation, without fear, without the weight that he had carried for so long. He found a small cafe on the waterfront, a place with a red awning and a window box full of geraniums, where the coffee was strong and the scones were fresh, and the view of the bay was as beautiful as any view he had ever seen. He sat down at a table by the window, ordered breakfast, and watched the steamers come and go, the ferries and the fishing boats and the yachts, all of them moving across the water in a dance that was as old as the hills, as old as the sea, as old as time itself. And he thought about Clara, not with pain, not with grief, but with gratitude. Gratitude for the years they had shared, the moments they had lived, the love that had shaped him into the man he was. He thought about the bridge that he had come to inspect, a structure of steel and concrete that spanned a river and carried people from one side to the other. And he thought about the other bridge, the one that he had built within himself, the one that had carried him from the darkness of grief to the light of a new morning. He finished his breakfast, paid his bill, and stepped out into the sunlight. The day was waiting for him, full of possibilities, full of promises, full of the simple, ordinary, miraculous wonder of being alive. He did not know what the future would bring, and he did not need to know. He was here, now, in this moment, in this place, and that was enough. He walked toward the town, toward the hills, toward the bridge that he had come to see, and as he walked, he whistled a tune, a soft, low tune that he had heard in a dream, a tune that was older than the bridges, older than the steamers, older than the towns and the cities and the railway lines that had changed the face of the world. It was the sound of the sea, the sound of the wind, the sound of the heart beating on, steady and true, carrying its own cargo of memory and hope and the quiet, enduring strength of love. And the paddle steamer to Oban sat at the pier, her engines humming, her decks quiet, ready to carry the next passenger, and the next, on their own journeys, through their own nights,